They didn't forget what they did to you. They remember every word they said, every lie they told, every moment they watched you fall apart and said nothing. But they stayed silent, not because they felt guilty, but because that silence was part of the plan all along. You kept asking yourself, am I overreacting? Am I losing my mind? But no, you weren't. You were being trained to question your own reality. And Carl Jung warned us, this kind of silence is not empty. It's a weapon. They saw it, you know? They saw the pain in your eyes when they said what they said. They noticed the way your shoulders dropped, how your breath caught, how your silence screamed louder than any words could. They knew the exact moment they crossed a line, but they never turned back. And you've spent days, weeks, maybe years now, trying to convince yourself they didn't mean it, that they just didn't understand, that maybe you're too sensitive, too intense, too much. But what if, I told you, they understood exactly what they were doing, and they did it anyway? Not in some accidental, heat-of-the-moment kind of way, but in a cold, calculated pattern they've used before, and will likely use again. Carl Jung once said that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But what he didn't say, at least not outright, is that those who cause harm without acknowledging it often understand far more than they pretend to. You see, the most dangerous kind of cruelty isn't loud. It's not yelling or slamming doors or public betrayal. It's quiet, invisible, wrapped in a soft tone and empty eyes. It's when someone hurts you deeply and then acts like nothing ever happened. And this isn't forgetfulness. This is a tactic. And it works because your mind wants to believe them, because if they didn't mean it, then maybe you're not broken. Maybe there's nothing wrong with you. Maybe it was all a misunderstanding, and peace can still be restored. And so you forgive them silently, even though they never asked. And you hold your breath hoping they'll one day say what you needed to hear, but deep down, you already know. They won't, because this isn't about memory. It's about power. People who refuse to acknowledge the harm they've caused aren't forgetful. They're emotionally evasive. And they use silence as a shield. A silence that says, I'm not wrong, and you're not worth explaining anything to. That's the message behind the quiet. That's the scream buried inside the silence. And while you lie awake at 2 a.m., replaying every word they said, they're sleeping just fine, not because they forgot, but because they detached, and detachment, when used like this, healing, it's weaponized comfort. They know how to make you doubt your memory, your emotions, your truth, and they do it so subtly, you begin to rewrite the story in their favor. You remove the parts where they looked straight at you and said what they said, you edit the tone, you lower the volume, you shrink your pain so they can stay innocent in your mind, because the alternative that they knew and still didn't care is too painful to accept. But here's the thing, that truth, as cruel as it is, will set you free, because once you see it, really see it, you'll stop twisting yourself into knots trying to make their silence mean something kind. You'll stop filling in their emotional blanks with your imagination, and you'll finally understand. They hurt you, they knew they did, and they chose silence because it's easier than accountability, safer than change, and far less painful for them than admitting they were wrong. But now, you're not the same person who once begged for closure, who once thought love meant carrying both your pain and theirs. Now you're starting to see what was always there, but hidden behind their carefully maintained mask. And the question is, are you ready to see what they never wanted you to notice? They didn't go silent because they forgot. They went silent because they knew it would leave you spiraling. They knew it would force you to carry the emotional weight for both of you. The silence wasn't clumsy or confused. It was controlled, precise, cold. It was designed to do exactly what it did: make you question yourself, beg for answers, over-explain your pain, and most of all, it let them escape untouched, unchallenged. And untouched people don't have to grow. They don't have to change. They just disappear into comfort while you stay up crafting closure in your head. Carl Jung spent decades studying this behavior, and he called it shadow projection, the unconscious act of dumping one's own unresolved darkness onto someone else. They hurt you, but they refuse to see that truth in themselves. So instead, they make you carry it. And here's where it gets cruel. It doesn't stop at denial. It turns into distortion. Suddenly, you're the one who's difficult, over-emotional, impossible to satisfy. And they, well, they're just doing their best. They're calm, they're composed, they're confused why you're so upset. It's not that they don't know what they did, it's that their ego can't afford to admit it. Because to admit it would crack the persona, the carefully built identity they've used to survive in a world that never taught them how to sit with guilt. And Jung warned us, the more we avoid the shadow, the more powerful it becomes. And when someone has spent their whole life running from accountability, that shadow starts to move on its own. It becomes a defense system, a voice in their head that says, don't admit anything, just flip it back on them. And they do. Not always with words, sometimes with a look, or with nothing at all. And that's where the silence comes in, because silence, in their world, is safer than truth. Let's make this real for a second. Have you ever confronted someone, gently, respectfully, vulnerably, and, instead of responding with reflection, they withdrew, they went quiet, maybe even made you feel guilty for bringing it up? That wasn't passivity, that was avoidance with a purpose. Because if they say nothing, they leave you carrying everything, and that imbalance becomes their refuge, while it becomes your prison. The irony. Many of these people think of themselves as kind, as thoughtful, as morally good, and that's the real trap. The deeper the self-image of goodness, the harder it becomes to face the parts of themselves that cause harm. Jung called this the inflation of the ego, a swollen sense of self that rejects anything that doesn't match the story it's told about itself. And so they'll protect that story at all costs, even if it means rewriting reality, even if it means letting you bleed in silence while they walk away clean. But now you're starting to see it, aren't you? Their silence wasn't emptiness. It was armor. It was a way to dodge the work of real connection. Because real connection means admitting fault, holding space for pain, choosing growth over comfort, and that was never their plan. Which begs the question, if silence is how they protect themselves, what are they protecting themselves from? You know what's even more dangerous than someone who hurts you? Someone who hurts you and truly believes they didn't. Not because it never happened, but because they've built an entire identity on the idea that they're a good person. They don't hurt people, that they're always reasonable, always balanced, always the one who means well, and anything that contradicts that image, it gets deleted, denied, or dumped onto someone else. And if you try to hold up a mirror, you become the problem, not because you were wrong, but because your truth threatens the character they've spent years perfecting. Carl Jung called this the persona, the mask we wear to survive in society. A carefully curated version of ourselves, polished for approval, coated in decency, but hollow underneath. And for many people, that persona isn't just a role, it becomes their religion. They worship the idea that they are kind, sensitive, not like the others, and anything that disrupts that illusion must be rejected, including your pain, including your reality, including you. So what happens when your truth collides with their illusion? They don't change, they don't reflect, they don't apologize, they retreat deeper into the script, the one where they're the misunderstood angel, and you're just too intense, too damaged, too dramatic, and the worst part, they actually believe it. They believe their own rewrite of the story, because admitting the full truth would cost them something they're not ready to give, their psychological comfort. Jung warned us about this pattern and called it the provisional life, a half-lived existence where people stay comfortable, stay innocent, stay untransformed, and they build emotional castles around themselves so tall, not even their own guilt can reach them, and every time you try to knock, they respond with spiritual platitudes, social media quotes, or silence. They pretend like they're above the chaos, when really, they're just avoiding the mirror. And here's what most people don't understand. People like this aren't faking it to fool you. They've fooled themselves first. That's why it's so convincing, so frustrating, because on the surface, they look calm, they sound composed. They may even say they wish you peace, but underneath, they're at war with everything they refuse to admit. And that war leaks onto everyone they get close to, especially the ones who love them enough to tell the truth. You became the villain not because you did something wrong, but because you pointed out the crack in their mask, and that crack, it terrified them, because if that mask slips even for a second, their whole internal system could collapse. Jung said, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, and for them, it's not just terrifying, it's unthinkable, because their goodness isn't just a trait, it's their shield, and they can't risk losing it, even if it means losing you. So here you are, still wondering if you were too harsh, too direct, too much. But what if the real question is this? What kind of person needs everyone else to be wrong just so they can feel right? It starts subtly. You bring up something they said that hurt you, not to attack them, not to blame, just to be seen, just to feel real again. But their face changes. They blink slower, tilt their head, maybe sigh just a little, and then they say something like, I didn't mean it like that, or you're taking it the wrong way. And just like that, the spotlight moves from their behavior to your reaction. Your pain becomes the problem, not the thing that caused it. And now, instead of healing, you're defending, explaining, doubting your own memory, and somehow, apologizing. Carl Jung warned us about this pattern, what he called shadow projection. where people unconsciously reject the parts of themselves they don't want to see and dump them onto someone else. They can't hold their guilt, so they hand it to you, wrapped in accusations of being too emotional, too dramatic, always playing the victim. And the more hurt you feel, the more they twist it into a story that justifies their detachment. You cry, they say you're manipulative. You go quiet. They say you're passive-aggressive. You ask for clarity. They say you're impossible to please. And suddenly, you're trapped in a narrative you never wrote. But it doesn't feel like gaslighting. At first it feels like maybe you just misunderstood. Maybe you're being unfair. Maybe it really wasn't that bad. And that's exactly how the spiral begins. Because the human mind, especially a kind one, wants to believe in peace, not war. So you internalize it, you swallow the discomfort. You shrink your truth to fit their denial. And the more you minimize your pain, the more they maximize their innocence. And this is where the real manipulation lives, not in yelling or control, but in quiet reversal, in making your wound look like evidence that you're unstable, ungrateful, or somehow unworthy of understanding. And if you're not careful, you start to believe them. You start to carry both the injury and the blame, both the confusion and the guilt. And that's no longer a relationship. That's psychological colonization. One person's comfort becomes built entirely on the other's silence. Here's the deeper truth Jung hinted at. People who can't face their own shadow will always find someone else to wear it. And if you're emotionally aware, empathetic, self-reflective, you become the perfect canvas for that projection. Not because you're weak, but because you care enough to consider their side. And they use that against you, not always maliciously, but reflexively, like a wounded animal protecting the very thing that's hurting others. This isn't just avoidance anymore, it's transfer of responsibility. It's making you the gatekeeper of their guilt, the emotional sponge for everything they won't hold. And the more mature you are, the more likely you've been targeted by someone emotionally immature, because they instinctively seek out people who will do the heavy lifting for them, carry the burden of accountability so they can keep pretending they're light. But now you're starting to see the difference between peace and erasure, between apology and redirection, between healing and manipulation dressed up as calm. And the question isn't, did I overreact? The question is, why did I keep handing them the brush to repaint my reality? They don't yell, they don't argue, they don't even say anything cruel. They just say nothing, and that's silence. It doesn't bring peace. It brings confusion, panic, emotional vertigo, because silence, when used by someone who hurt you, isn't emptiness, it's a trap. And suddenly, your brain goes into overdrive, trying to fill in the blanks. You replay every conversation, analyze every pause, every micro-expression, wondering if you were the problem. And that's the genius of their strategy. They don't have to rewrite the story. You'll do it for them. Carl Jung understood this dynamic deeply. He wrote that silence can shift the emotional burden onto the one who's already hurting. When they go quiet, you start narrating, you start questioning, you start building explanations to protect the connection, because humans crave closure, not chaos. And silence feels like rejection with no explanation. And the mind hates unfinished stories, so it writes the most generous ending it can even when it's false. And here's where it gets darker, because the longer they stay silent, the more desperate you become for resolution. And that desperation, it's not weakness, it's biology. It's your nervous system begging for safety, for clarity, for reassurance that the person you trusted hasn't suddenly vanished behind a wall of indifference. And so you start chasing, apologizing for things you didn't do, softening your tone, second-guessing your truth, all in the hope that their silence will finally break. But it rarely does, because silence is the message. It says, I'm not wrong, I don't owe you anything, your pain isn't enough to move me. And the longer it continues, the more your emotional boundaries blur, and you start feeling grateful for the smallest crumbs of response. A half-hearted text, a neutral look, a fake smile, becomes a relief. And this is how the dependency forms what Jung would describe as psychological imbalance, masked as attachment. You're doing all the emotional labor while they do nothing, and yet somehow, they hold all the power, and you're the one lying awake. While they post vacation photos, you're the one checking your phone, while they go ghost. And it's not because they don't know how you feel, it's because your pain doesn't fit into the narrative where they're the good one, so they ignore it until you either break down or back off, both of which validate their silent decision to stay distant. What's wild is that this silence can feel like punishment, but it's framed like maturity. They'll say they just needed space, or that they didn't want to make things worse, but in truth, they just didn't want to take responsibility. And silence let them avoid the mirror. Again, they didn't need to win the argument, because silence handed them the trophy by default. And meanwhile, you start wondering if you're crazy, too sensitive, or just hard to love. But you're not. You're just reacting to a system designed to starve you of emotional reality until you abandon yourself trying to earn theirs. So here's the real question: if they need to say nothing in order to stay innocent, then what does that say about the version of themselves they're so desperate to protect? By now, you've probably realized something deeply unsettling. No matter what you say, no matter how gently you express your pain, they don't just dismiss it, they deflect it. And not because they're heartless, but because they've trained themselves to survive truth by avoiding it at all costs. This isn't about forgetting. This is about protecting an ego that can't handle the weight of accountability. Carl Jung called this psychological inflation, a state where the ego becomes so enlarged, so fragile, that any information contradicting its self-image is treated like an existential threat. You say, "That hurt me," and they hear, "You're a bad person." You ask for reflection, they feel attacked. You bring up a pattern, they vanish. And what you're seeing isn't confusion, it's strategy. Not always conscious, but deeply wired. A pattern of psychological self that operates like a firewall between their actions and their sense of self. They can't be wrong, not because the facts aren't there, but because being wrong would collapse the entire emotional structure they've built their life around. Jung warned us about this. He said that some people develop ego defense mechanisms so strong they can't distinguish discomfort from danger. To them, guilt isn't a signal for growth, it's a bomb under their identity, so they shut it down before it even registers. And here's the twist. The more insightful your words, the more reflective your truth, the more intensely they defend against it, because deep down, they know. But knowing requires transformation, and transformation demands pain. So instead, they weaponize dismissal. They ghost you and call it peace. They avoid eye contact and call it maturity. They say, "I just didn't want drama," when what they really mean is, "I wasn't ready to face myself." And while they walk away emotionally untouched, you're left carrying not only your pain, but the confusion of their refusal to acknowledge it. And this is how the weapon works. It doesn't just block truth, it reverses it. Your honesty becomes an attack. Your vulnerability becomes ammunition. And your love, it becomes something they hide from, because it shines too bright against the mask they've worn too long. And if you've ever wondered why someone would rather lose you than admit they were wrong, this is why. Because for them, admitting fault doesn't feel like a mistake, it feels like annihilation. And they'd rather rewrite the story, change the subject, or surround themselves with people who validate their version of events, than sit in the discomfort of seeing who they really are. Jung called this shadow avoidance. And it doesn't just harm the one who avoids, it poisons every connection around them. But here's the hard part: when you confront someone who's built their identity around not being wrong, you're not just asking for an apology, you're asking them to dismantle their entire psychological armor. And most people won't do that. They'll fight, flee, or freeze. Anything but face what you're offering, a moment of truth that could set them free if they were ready. So the next time someone refuses to admit what they did, ask yourself this: are they defending themselves from you, or from the version of themselves they're terrified to meet? By this point, you might be wondering, how do they live with themselves? How do they hurt people, deny it, rewrite the story, and still look in the mirror without flinching? The answer is as disturbing as it is simple. They've built a world where they're always right, always misunderstood, always the one who tried. And that world, it's not real, but it feels safe. And people will choose the illusion of safety over the pain of self-awareness every time. Carl Jung studied this pattern for decades, and he called it the psychological echo chamber. A mental space where no new truth is allowed in unless it confirms the old narrative. They surround themselves with friends who never challenge them, partners who shrink to keep the peace, spiritual quotes that sound deep but mean nothing, and social media posts that preach growth while avoiding depth. And in that carefully curated bubble, they're the hero, the healer, the empath, the one who caused harm. And when someone like you comes along, someone honest, reflective, courageous enough to say, "This hurt me," you don't just threaten their ego, you threaten the entire system they've constructed. And rather than face that collapse, they'll cast you as unstable, disloyal, or too emotional to be trusted, not because it's true, but because it has to be true for their version of reality to remain intact. This is why the cycle repeats, not because they're clueless, but because they're committed to never being the villain, no matter what the facts say. And over time, this commitment becomes a lifestyle, a reflex, a full psychological ecosystem designed to keep them from ever having to change. And so they float from relationship to relationship, crisis to crisis. And every time something breaks, they rewrite the script. They were toxic. I was just trying my best. No one understands me. And that script, it gets rehearsed so often, they start to believe it. And here's the cruelest part, they'll say they want peace, growth, healing. But what they actually want is comfort that never asks for change. And if peace requires self-confrontation, they'll choose denial wrapped in positivity every single time. Jung called this unconscious pattern repetition. And it's not random, it's rehearsed, and it's effective, because it keeps them protected but dangerously unchanged. Meanwhile, you're left in the aftermath, trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. Asking yourself, why does this keep happening? Was it me? Did I miss the signs? But the truth is, the signs were there. You just weren't looking for someone building a fantasy, you were looking for someone ready to build a future. And now, you're starting to realize the hardest truth of all. You can't wake someone who's decided to keep dreaming. You've waited, haven't you? For that one message, that moment of clarity, the words that would make the pain make sense? I'm sorry. I was wrong. You didn't deserve that, but it never came. And deep down, a part of you still believes it might, that maybe one day, they'll wake up, realize the damage, and finally reach for you, not to explain, not to defend, but to take responsibility. And here's the truth most people never say out loud, the one Jung spent his life trying to explain. They won't, and not because they're unwilling, but because they're psychologically unequipped to do so. You see, real apology requires a level of ego integration most people never develop. It means facing the shadow, holding space for both your good intentions and your harmful actions. It means looking someone in the eye and saying, yes, I did that, without collapsing into shame or fleeing into denial. And for someone who's spent their whole life defending a fragile self-image, that kind of honesty doesn't feel like growth, it feels like death. Jung called this the moral function of the unconscious, that quiet inner voice that says, you hurt someone, now go make it right. But for people who never learn to separate their behavior from their identity, admitting wrongdoing doesn't feel like something they did, feels like something they are. And if they're wrong, then they're unlovable, broken, worthless. So they reject that truth before it even has a chance to reach them. That's why, when you tell them how they made you feel, they don't respond with compassion, they respond with collapse or combat. They deny, deflect, or disappear, not because you were too harsh, but because they lack the internal structure to hold the truth of their own impact. And this isn't a one-time reaction, it's a pattern, a deeply embedded psychological blueprint that says, my comfort matters more than your clarity. And it gets worse, because in the absence of their apology, you start to apologize to yourself. You rationalize their silence, you lower your standards, you convince yourself that closure is overrated. And that's how emotional starvation becomes emotional conditioning. They never had to say they were sorry, because you trained yourself to need less, expect less, accept less, and call it healing. But real healing, it starts the moment you stop waiting for accountability from someone who's emotionally bankrupt, someone who's never learned to love without controlling the narrative, someone who would rather abandon the relationship than confront their reflection in it. And it's devastating, because it means letting go of the fantasy that this time will be different, that if you just explain it better, softer, calmer, they'll understand. But they won't, because understanding you would require understanding themselves, and they've spent their whole life avoiding that mirror. Jung once said, guilt, when processed, leads to growth, but guilt, when rejected, becomes projection, distortion, even aggression. And many people never make the transition, not because they're evil, but because they're emotionally unevolved, stuck at a developmental stage where their entire worth depends on being seen as innocent. And when innocence is your identity, accountability feels like annihilation. So here's the truth, you didn't want but desperately need. They're not going to apologize, not now, not later, not the way you hoped, and it has nothing to do with your worth, and everything to do with their limits. Which leaves one final question only you can answer. What do you do with pain that will never be acknowledged? Here's what Carl Jung knew, and what most of us learn the hard way: not everyone is meant to grow. Not everyone is ready to face their shadow. Not everyone was designed to evolve just because you were. And that's not judgment, it's clarity. Because you've spent too much time trying to drag unconscious people into the light, thinking if you just love harder, explain softer, wait longer, they'll wake up. But awakening is a choice, not a reward. And some people will spend their entire lives protecting the very defenses that keep them small. You're not wrong for hoping, for holding space, for believing people can change. But now you're starting to understand that you can't do the work for them. You can't carry both the wound and the repair, both the truth and the denial, both your growth and their avoidance. And that kind of emotional labor will break even the strongest spirit. Not because you're weak, but because it was never yours to hold in the first place. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And becoming who you are requires letting go of who they refuse to be. It means grieving the apology you'll never get, mourning the version of them that existed only in your hope, and stepping out of the cycle that made you mistake pain for potential. You were never meant to prove your worth to someone committed to misunderstanding you, never meant to beg for healing from someone who fears their own brokenness more than they value connection. You're allowed to walk away, not in bitterness, but in clarity, not because they're evil, but because they're unequipped, not because you gave up, but because you finally understood real love does not require and accountability isn't something you have to earn. It's something emotionally mature people offer freely, and if it isn't free, it isn't real. Your closure doesn't come from their words. It comes from your decision to stop waiting. Your peace doesn't need their permission. It needs your protection. Your healing doesn't begin with their honesty. It begins with your refusal to keep betraying yourself for the sake of being understood. This isn't the ending you wanted, but maybe it's the freedom you need, because when you stop explaining your pain to people who benefit from ignoring it, you create space for those who are already fluent in empathy, already fluent in depth, already fluent in accountability, and those people, they exist, but you'll never meet them if you stay circling the same story with someone who refuses to turn the page. So maybe now, the question isn't, will they ever understand me? Maybe the real question is, what kind of life opens up when I stop needing them to? You're not crazy? You're becoming conscious.